Hello everyone. Welcome to our session. Who would have imagined electric vehicles and careers in EV infrastructure? My name is Charles Satterfield. I'm the Senior Manager of Electric Transportation with the Edison Electric Institute. Joining me today are Alex Karros, the lead architect of EV charging for General Motors, and Sarah Nielsen, an executive director on the customer experience team with Consumers Energy in Michigan. So Alex and Sarah will be telling us about the transition to EVs from the perspective of both an auto manufacturer and energy company, as well as providing some information on the career opportunities in the field of EVs. So I'm sure there will be questions, so we will be reserving time at the end of the session for Q&A. So before I jump into things, I just want to briefly set the stage regarding the current market for electric vehicles, or EVs as they're commonly known. So EVs refers to vehicles which you plug in to charge. So that includes fully battery electric vehicles that only run on electricity, as well as plug-in hybrids that have a backup internal combustion engine. So not included are hybrids which have an onboard battery but rely on their internal combustion engine to charge it. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with EVs. There's probably a reason why you're here at this session. They've been getting a lot of press lately. I'm sure everybody's seen at least a few commercials. There were a number of Super Bowl spots last year. So that all speaks to growth, the recent growth in the EV market. So 2021 has been really a banner year for EVs so far. By August, EVs had already surpassed the best year they'd ever had, and they still got 4 months left to go. There are a large number of new models available, with many more planned on the way. So there are already a number of offerings in, say, the sedan and like crossover SUV segments, but you saw that there are a lot of plans out there for light trucks, vans, that sort of thing. So the new models are on the way. There's a lot of proposed federal funding for EVs and the charging infrastructure in the proposed infrastructure bill. There's been a push to electrify large public and private fleets, like Amazon's delivery fleet. They're trying to fully electrify that, as well as the federal fleet. President Biden had issued an executive order early on regarding switching over the entire federal fleet, which is the largest in the country, to fully battery electric. So obviously this is a big shift, and I would just like to highlight that there's more than just buying a different type of car. It's a true rethinking of transportation and the associated infrastructure to support that new mode of transportation. So the way you plan trips, where, when, and how you refuel, what you refuel with, how people build garages, houses, apartment buildings. It's really the biggest change in transportation since we moved from horses to cars. And we're really excited to talk about the tremendous opportunities that arise from that. So with that said, I would like to start off with Alex, just to provide some context on the growth in the popularity of electric vehicles. So Alex, what would you say is driving the increased demand for EVs?
There's probably a variety of first of all, welcome everybody, and thanks for having me, and appreciate the opportunity to chat a bit. So what's driving the demand? Probably a few different variables. At the highest level, decarbonization of our economy, whether it's the business interests in doing that, or certainly the regulatory or the public policy means of influencing that is certainly pushed, if you will, jump-started an industry towards here. I think now we're at a point that we're transitioning from what I would say a more or less a policy-driven to now more or less a customer-driven, customer-centric sort of interest in it. And so you talked about all that investment. Folks have seen it. GM had our investor day last week. In fact, I was a part of it. And we're touting the $35 billion worth of investment that we're making into EVs and actually autonomous vehicles at the same time. And to put that in context, it's obviously a significant number. But when you see the Hummer, or you see the Lyric, the Cadillac Lyric, and those really iconic cars, that's a moment in time where we're sort of showing off a lot of hard work that's gone into it. When we announce a battery plant or a manufacturing plant, like in our backyard Factory Zero here in Detroit and Hamtramck, now we're committed. And the long and short is we are so committed to electrification now, we can't unwind our investments. And the fact is, we're betting more on electrification in the future of electrification than we are in the internal combustion engine, which means in 5, 6 years, if we don't all put these puzzle pieces together, Alex is knocking on all of your doors asking for a job, not the other way around. So so that's sort of the impetus. But I think the really cool part of it is it's just a better system, right? It's an overall, when you start to think about what Sarah's going to say and how we work together and we start to couple our energy ecosystem and our transportation energy system, we could do some really slick things, right? We can charge when it's good for the grid, and good for the grid can be the cheapest. It can be the lowest carbon when the wind's blowing, right? When the sun's shining. That means it usually saves money for everybody, but it saves a lot of money for the people who are driving those vehicles around. If you haven't driven an EV, they're awesome. They're fun to drive. There's great video. I'm a Top Gear guy, and we'll celebrate Top Gear today. For those that don't know, is a British motorsports show. It went on the air 19 years ago today. Just a fun fact in case you were wondering. And they took not to tout a competitor, they took a Model X against essentially a Challenger Hellcat. So one of the largest supercharged internal combustion engines out there. And the Model X chewed up the Hellcat. So that's a sort of cool thing, right? I mean, you start to look at cars in a much different light. And I think the cool factor, the design factor, allows you to do a lot of things. So this started off sort of in that sort of had to do. And now I think we're moving into wow, this is really cool. This really opens up a broad opportunity for everyone.
Great, thank you. So you mentioned some of the, we're heading towards decarbonization and EVs are fun to drive. Everybody's seen kind of the videos of, just EVs on the street zooming past everybody. But can you take a second to talk a little bit more about some of the other benefits of EVs? So like, the cost of fuel and the convenience factor, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I often say us engineers try to overcomplicate this sometimes, right? I try to tell everything at once. And one of the really great convenience stories I have is my wife drives our EV often. And the first time she brought it home during a snowstorm, she was in high heels and actually dressed up for work and looking good. And she looked at me and said, "I'm so happy I just got to pull it in my garage." Right. And she's like, "I don't have to be at a gas station filling up in the snowstorm." And, like there's these little sort of convenience benefits, and they're not for everyone, right? There's obviously some challenges with making sure there's enough infrastructure for multifamily and apartments and condos. So I don't want to tout that there's no challenges yet to solve. But when you start to look at that and you save 15 minutes not going to a gas station anymore, right? And you're able to charge when you're doing other things already. Really, really slick. Also, the fuel costs, as you mentioned, while the vehicles these days and the battery technology is a little bit more expensive up front, there is generally cost savings on a sort of a per mile or per gallon or per energy equivalent basis, however you want to see it. Sarah can talk more about it, but roughly in Michigan, for example, we're talking about $1.50, maybe $2 a gallon, depending on when you're charging. Versus, I think I just filled up yesterday at $3.50 a gallon. So those savings, or the costs that you might pay up front, are benefits driven backwards. Then you start to layer on, again, as I was saying, if you charge when it's good for the grid, you can even come down those cost curves. So Sarah and I our teams are talking about how do we make it even more seamless, right? Make it really easy for customers to take advantage of those rates or time of use rates, and we just do that in the background on behalf of the customer. So there's a full suite of benefits, part of which we know, and part of which we'll unlock in the future because we haven't even gotten there yet.
That's great. So going back to charging, what is that experience like for the average consumer right now? And what are some of the opportunities there? Because I mentioned at the top of the call about how people build houses to accommodate, kind of like when dryers moved into homes, people were installing circuits to support that. What do you see happening, in that realm, like the charging experience, and how do you see it evolving over time?
Yeah, great question. So I'll give you a two-part answer. For the folks who like my wife and heels answer, the version of it is charging is just like charging your cell phone. You're gonna bring it, you're gonna plug it in, you're gonna walk away, it's gonna get charged. If I asked most of you how long does it take to charge your cell phone, minus the Android users where it tells you how long to fill, you probably don't pay attention, right? You just plug it in when you need to plug it in. Now we have the convenience of a lot of plugs. The flip side of that is the more technical answer. Charging will happen in different places, most of which will happen where you live because the car sits there generally overnight, and most of the time you'll have access to charging. And so I'd say 85-90% of charging of the kilowatt hours that you put into that battery and use will probably happen when you're sleeping, when you're at home. And so building the necessary infrastructure, as you talked about, getting homes ready, in that is sort of the journey that we're going to be on over the next 5, 10, 15 years to really upfit people's houses, make sure they have enough energy, do the cool things like I talked about in that. The other side of it is there's opportunities associated with workplace charging. So working with employers to put in charging for a variety of reasons. A, if you don't have charging at home and you go to work every day, that's a really nice sort of balance to be able to do it. B, they're actually, the more, for example, solar that we put onto the grid, you're not going to be charging cars at night when you're sleeping. You want to be charging them when the sun is shining, and the sun is shining when your car is plugged in at work. And so thinking about those types of opportunities will be an important one. And then public charging. So I'll put them into two categories. Public, when you're about town, what we're doing now is putting more and more charging in places like grocery stores. For those old people like me who spend still 45 minutes walking through a grocery store because it is quiet time away from my 8-year-old and 10-year-old. I didn't say that. It allows you that time. So maybe it's a workout facility, right? It's places where you're there for half an hour to 2 hours, and it really allows you to get a substantial amount of charge back in your backyard. Then how do I get to grandma's house, right? How do we take that long trip? Maybe it's 200-300 miles to really embrace it. And so working to build charging, I'll call it for picture painting, every 50 miles along the highway so you have access to adequate charging. So we are creating what we call as an ecosystem, right? A charging ecosystem that surrounds the customer. And then we start to layer in that ecosystem, not just the tools, but the services and the apps and those sorts of things to make it easy. Those of you who've sort of experienced it, most EVs, you can sort of open it up, plug in a route, drive to grandma's house from Detroit to Chicago, tells you to stop in Kalamazoo and start charging. You do it, you pay for it from the app. It's really, really seamless. So it's not only building that network, but also essentially the tools, services, and conveniences to make it even easier as you use it.
Great. Well, actually, that kind of leads me into some of my questions for Sarah. So thank you there, Alex. So to Sarah, to bridge into the infrastructure component, so with a transition, as significant as this one, it's one thing to have electric cars and buses and vans out there, but they won't function unless they have the power they need. So I'm sure many people with us today have seen electric charging stations popping up in their communities. Can you tell us a bit about how those work and the different options that, well, actually, let me see. Alex covered that one a little bit. So why don't we skip to how electric companies like consumers are supporting the proliferation of that sort of infrastructure, those charging points for people who both, regardless of where they live, be it a single family home or multi-unit dwelling.
Yep. So yeah, I think Alex did a great job outlining the different places where we are putting chargers in and the type of chargers, which really just comes down to the speed that they're transferring electrons into your batteries. And so, yeah, utilities are playing a role at each of those points. So the public infrastructure, which is the one everyone's probably most familiar with, is being developed by a number of different groups, but often around the country there are utilities that are putting in public infrastructure. So I can say specifically in Michigan, we've put in over 200 public chargers over the last couple of years, mostly level 2s, but over 30 DC fast chargers as well. And now these are ones that we are partnering with site hosts in the community that raised their hand and said, yes, I want to put a charger here. And we're helping get those in the ground. So that's happening in every state right now. Companies like GM with Alex is very heavily involved in thinking about that too. So there's a lot of interest in figuring out what that public infrastructure looks like. We're also looking at workplace charging, as Alex mentioned, and then the home, of course, is a really big one. And for your single family home with an attached garage, I think that's like your kind of like the easy scenario. And as a utility, utilities are doing a number of things to help incentivize and help customers get their chargers hooked up and get them on a good rate so that they can best enjoy those benefits of EV charging. So a lot of things going on there. I will say too, on the public infrastructure piece of it, there's been a nice initiative lately with utilities to start looking beyond our territories and make sure that we are developing a coalition to make sure that as a customer, a driver is driving across different utility territories, they get one experience all the way from New York City to LA. So looking at how we connect all those chargers all the way across to Alex's vision of like one every 50 miles or so. So definitely looking within our own territory and across to make sure that that's going to help people.
That's great. So beyond the kind of customer facing portion of the plug, the station itself where you plug in, what has the experience been like for, say, consumers about building the infrastructure kind of behind where those charging stations are? So just as you mentioned before, the only real difference between different types of charger stations is the power level, how quickly they move electrons into the battery. But that also requires some upgrades of the grid itself. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about the process, what that has been like for consumers.
Yeah, well, I would say it will eventually require upgrades to the grid. Right now, we're nowhere near the penetration that would require that. And I think we're going to be okay for a while, especially considering if the success that we continue to have with people charging off peak. I think the grid has a lot of space to grow on that. But, if we meet those goals that Alex and I and a lot of others are working on, then we will start to see, a good amount of bandwidth on the grid. So when we think about it from a grid planning perspective, if we look across the entire grid, there's a lot of capacity. But when you start to zoom in on neighborhoods and like what we would call like a substation on the grid side, that's where you'll start to see some pinch points initially, because there's going to be neighborhoods that tend to have clustering of EVs more so than others. And you can imagine that if there's all of a sudden, every house on a street has an EV, that's going to overload that substation nearby faster than if it was more spread out. So that's the type of thing we're looking at right now. We're tracking where EVs are popping up and what substations they're attached to, and just paying attention to that as we go. We're also like working hard to figure out, how do we stay ahead of this and make sure that we're, growing with the market. But I think it's those localized areas that we have to pay attention to the most.
All right. One last question for you is, what do energy companies see as potential other applications of EVs, such as vehicle-to-grid technology, which would allow cars to send power back to the grid during times of high demand?
Yeah, so I made this joke the other day, but if you remember like the old cartoons where a character is really hungry and they see another character and it just turns into like a T-bone steak. And for the utility, like when we look at an EV, it just turns into a battery. Because at the end of the day, that's what's exciting for us, and that's how we need to think about it as a utility. Right now, it's more of a one-way like energy user, but that's a battery that's in each of those EVs driving around that has the potential to act like a battery on our system. And so I think it is really exciting to think about what that could look like, where we're not only shooting energy into it, but also potentially bringing it out, whether it's a vehicle to home or vehicle back to the grid, or what I hear a lot now is V2X, which is vehicle to everything. It certainly has these opportunities to help with resiliency, both, so like I said, so even if it's like your own house and stabilizing, if each house is a little more stable because they've got their EV, that's going to help the neighborhood overall. And then each of those benefits, as it gets more stable, is just going to keep helping the grid.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Now I'd like to turn towards the career opportunities, both now and in the future, that are being enabled by the electrification of vehicles. So, Sarah, back to you. What kind of jobs is consumers, and do you think will energy companies be hiring for in this area?
Yeah, well, I know I'm biased, but utilities are such an exciting place to work. And I know that might be a surprise to people. But we really are on the front lines of so many of these energy questions, if that is something that's of interest to people. Particularly on the EV front, I'd say increasingly utilities are adding electric vehicle programs like the programs that my team runs. So if you're interested in designing customer products, understanding customer need, product lifecycle management, marketing, development, funding, all that stuff, utility programs are developing them right now. There's also a major grid planning component to this that we already alluded to. So we work heavily with our grid planning team to help try to predict where we're going to see electric vehicles, and then answer questions like, where do we need to do upgrades, and how much do we do now versus later? There's these really interesting timing questions. So that's another big one. And then I was also thinking about like groups that we interact with a lot. So obviously the OEMs, and Alex will be able to cover that one. I think another really interesting place is like government agencies, whether it's state or federal, or even your local municipalities, thinking about urban planning and transportation, the future of how you want to be doing that. So those are groups that we work with a lot. That could be an interesting one too.
Very cool. So what about education? Do you hire right out of high school, or the requirements for technical school or college, or does it kind of run the gamut?
Yeah, I would say for more of the product related roles, looking for a college degree there. Certainly on the grid planning side, those are going to be your engineering degrees. And I know utilities have various different types of engineering track programs to get folks in the door, internships that are offered for this type of thing. So there might be, if you are interested, like very specific EV related internships available, but the other two good places to look would be, like I said, in the engineering department, because a lot of grid planning questions are around electric vehicles right now. And then the other one to look at is strategy. So a lot of utility corporate strategy are going to be asking questions about electric vehicles. So that could be another good place to look too.
All right, thank you. So Alex, same question to you. What kind of jobs are autos, do you see coming in the EV space for the auto industry?
Yes. I mean, I think, Sarah, you sort of captured the essence. There's not going to be a job that is not touched by electrification. Any type of job that you can imagine that you would want to participate. You're a developer, right? You want to play around with websites. You want to build apps. You want to get into the planning side of things that Sarah was talking about. You want new business models to help GM and consumers think about, how do I make sure that electron is efficiently delivered? You want to go build the car. You want to go build charging stations. You want to create charging networks. You want to get into the public policy side of things. You want to be on the city planning side of things to help influence those policies. There is not a job description in my mind that is not going to be affected. You think about the utility industry in the United States as well as the OEM space. And I guess I don't know how many jobs are affected by it. I probably should have looked that up, but a lot, right? And so I would say there's just a myriad of options across the board. So I mean, to sort of follow some of the questions that you were describing, right? If you're a get your hands dirty type of guy, which I love doing, in fact, I miss it sitting at a desk here most of the time, but like you can imagine roles and responsibilities that are, hey, let's go become an electrician, right? There in Detroit right now, it's no shortage of some of those roles that go out there, and how cool to go out and build the network and not just say, hey, I get to think it in my mind, and then there's these people who come and create it, right? They pour the concrete, they set down the equipment, they energize it, they pull the permits, those sorts of things, all the way to the same version of that on the vehicle manufacturing side of, right? Who we're hiring more and more folks. A lot of those folks are already there on the line. So that's sort of the one world of like, hey, I'm not I'm much more interested in being able to get out and get my hands dirty on that, right? You sort of transition to people who come straight out of college. I just actually hired somebody on my team who's just came out of a track program who is going to help me think about fleets and fleet electrification and everything in that. My expectations for her is everything from the business modeling to sort of commercial arrangements. She comes from the dev world, so she's been involved in the back office communication work and app development. So she's going to help make sure the APIs and those sorts of things are there. All the way to, I got an MBA on my team who does all the business development stuff. The big deals that you hear about GM, we announced an intention to spend $750 million on infrastructure development over the next 4 or 5 years, right? He's the guy that's putting those deals together to make that happen. And we have analysts on the team who love spreadsheets, who help build those spreadsheets for us and nail it down. And then you have, I don't like spreadsheets, but like you have people like me who are there to help lead it. So there's not a role that really cannot be developed depending on your interest. And I'll tell you, the thing that I love the most, one of the most things of passion is not just the automaker stuff and the utility stuff, but the intersection, right? I think there's going to be such a mass amount of innovation that happens between Sarah's world and my world that we are trying to dream up. But once we start doing, we'll have such an imagination and such a really rethinking of like, oh, we couldn't even imagine we could do something like that, right? Like that to me is seamlessly the sun shining and you're charging my vehicle, or the opposite, the sun stopped charging and now you're discharging my vehicle, to Sarah's point. Man, it's a fun time. And if you don't hear it in my voice, then I've failed you. But there's really a lot of really great opportunities right now.
Well, thank you, Alex. I don't know. I would like to kind of echo what you said, because it's very true. I mean, if you think about it, these are the two of the largest industries in the U.S., both the energy industry and the auto industry, and they're both undergoing a massive shift. And people often say, we were competing for the same talent, but that just means there's twice as many jobs, twice as many opportunities. I can speak from personal experience that there's already more demand than supply in the EV space, in terms of, individuals and career opportunities. So if there's one thing
that Charles, is that your pitch?
Yeah. But if there's just one thing that everybody takes away from this, I think it should be that kind of, we're already in a deficit of, people in the EV space, and that gap's only going to grow. So, you guys picked a good panel to be on. So, one last question to both of you. So diversity, equity, and inclusion is an important focus for both of your industries. So what steps are your companies taking to ensure that the growing number of career opportunities in electric transportation are available to everyone?
Yeah,
Whoever wants to kick it off.
I'll go first. Well, I'll just give a quick pitch. So I'm an Army veteran myself, and so I know there's a lot of veterans that come to these panels every year. And if that's the case, then just wanted to give a shout out to that. I think that there's a very good motivation in terms of a national security perspective to all this that we haven't really covered, but I think it's an awesome place for veterans to be working. So I think that's one area where I love to see activity. The direct place where a utility can help with this, and it's a little wonky, so just bear with me, but the concept is that the more load we get from these vehicles that are joining the grid and that are charging when we have excess capacity means we're getting that load without needing to install more costs, and then that can benefit everyone on the grid. Whether or not you have an EV, you're going to get the benefit of that additional load because of the way we end up spreading costs across customers. So I know that's wonky, but that's basically the concept, is that as electric vehicles join the grid and are charging at a time where there's excess capacity, it's going to benefit everyone ultimately. So, and that's an exciting thing that we as the utilities can make sure happens. I think the other places, and this gets more into probably Alex's lane, but the other places that we're seeing, one is just the access to electric vehicles. And so we're going to see a lot more used vehicles coming over the next 10 years that will help people who are priced out of the new vehicles. And then also the medium and heavy duty, the fleet vehicles that Alex already mentioned, city buses, school buses, transit vehicles, ride share vehicles. I think there's going to be a lot more ways that people can access electric vehicles in the future.
Yeah, so those who don't know me, I grew up in the restaurant business. It's a 100-year-old family restaurant here in downtown Detroit. And something my dad taught me very early on is everybody's money's greed. So I say that a little bit tongue in cheek, not to disregard a really serious issue around thinking about how to do this equitably. I say it more as a means of we have to flip some of these items a little bit on their head and think about what the business opportunities might be in there. So amongst other things, there really is opportunity, I think, Sarah, in how you describe some of those. One of the things that I was pretty actively involved when GM had a shared mobility service called Maven was we were getting EVs into the hands of folks that would have never even dreamt of being in an EV. They were Uber and Lyft gig economy workers who were renting vehicles, and we put together a program that really allowed a lot of folks to drive a car that they otherwise wouldn't even probably afford, but more importantly, probably even think about, right? Because they had other priorities on their list. And so we have to be creative, and we have to think about those business opportunities, in my mind, is really fundamental towards growing this. We also have to make sure we pause, right? And every time we do things, we make sure that we do have a lens that think about how does that community want to bring EVs into their life. And I think, Sarah, you a great example, right? We often think about individual vehicles and individual cars, but the reality is there's a host of opportunities with transit and fleets and making sure that we're electrifying all of these opportunities across the board. So I think we have to make sure when we put charging stations in, those charging stations are fairly equitable. We took, for example, that Maven data and we overlaid it on top of our internal combustion engine vehicles that we were also renting in LA and said, what does the data look like? Surprise, surprise. The vehicles drove around where the stations were, even though those vehicles were housed in neighborhoods that we might consider, underserved, right? So we have to use that data, look at it, and go into those communities and say, hey, how do we build it with you? How do we think about it, and very thoughtfully doing it and making sure we put those puzzle pieces together? So And we use underserved communities and diversity and equity, but you, Sarah, great opportunity, right? Veterans, we think about ADA. We got to make sure charging stations are not a pain in the ass to use for every community member, whether it's my 90-year-old grandma or it's somebody who might be in a wheelchair. So we really do have to, and I think the industry is spending a lot of time putting those types of lenses on everything we do. But I also think we can do it with a lens of hey, how do we create some business opportunities here for those communities and as well as ourselves, right? How can we go electrify shared use opportunities in places of worship, as an example, right? We can think really creatively in that space. So it's something I'm pretty passionate about as the guy grew up in the middle of Detroit, and I think there's some really neat opportunities to go grow the market and get more EVs out on the road.
All right, very cool. Well, thank you both for that. I would like to open it up to any questions from the audience right now. Feel free to, if you'd like to unmute yourself or put it in the chat, either way. Well, we got.
Hi, Charles. This is Sharon Miller. I was just wondering. I heard Sarah mention used EVs and that might be a target market. I don't know that she said it like that, but our poorest communities. I've seen some chatter lately about them getting the second tier, the used cycle of EVs. And can you talk a little bit about battery life and, are we talking about resale on EVs yet? Has that become a conversation? And where battery replacement, those kind of things? What's the story on that?
Yeah, so we are talking about resale and remarketing, and it's an important part of the dynamic of actually churning and putting investment into the overall market. Our job is to make sure that battery stays in that EV for as long as it possibly can. And what you'll see is as EVs become more capable, I think we become less and less sort of concerned about some of those deployment opportunities. So EVs and the battery health will be really associated with each other in terms of remarketing and value as it grows up. But I also don't think, and I do think, there will be business opportunities to, for example, put new batteries into used EVs, or for example, pull that battery out and go do something else with it that's more valuable, as Sarah can talk to, right? So the reality is that I don't think you use the poorest communities were sort of be regulated to use EV market. I don't think there's inherently something bad in a used EV, to say it that way. I think what would be bad is not actively building the infrastructure in those communities, so those people couldn't even consider buying an EV, or working with their landlords to make sure they had charging, so if they wanted to have access to it, they could. Right? Used EVs could be a really good value. And if you compare that really good value with really low cost of energy that we just talked about, that's a really good opportunity for some of those communities. So how do we go help educate and bring those types of business models to market?
Yeah, I'll just add one thing, but I love all those points Alex made. The last thing I would just add, though, because you were just saying it could be a really good value on the car, and then if there's low charging rates, then that's great. And then the other thing is there is probably going to be a lot of life on that battery, even after it's not able to be used for a car anymore. That's why I raised my hand and said, we'll take them at the utility. So those are batteries that, they're not safe for a car anymore because cars have very high demands on what they need a battery to do, but they are safe to be stationary storage, kind of like a racehorse that's like, done with their racing days, but they're able to go out in the pasture and get hooked up to the grid. So that could be another source of value for someone if they've got an old car that it's no longer able to be used, they can still probably do something with that battery.
In an abundance of clarity, we're not talking about an EV with 100,000 miles at that point. We're probably talking about an EV at 150 or 200,000 miles that if it had an internal combustion engine, we'd probably be replacing the engine. So when we're talking about the battery in this context, it just in terms of replacement, we're talking about a car that's probably 10 plus years old in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
that was an important piece of information, Alex. Critical to know.
Yeah.
Huh. Well, that's
Yeah, I
it.
think that, I mean, the 10-year warranty is standard pretty much on batteries right now, right, Alex? Yeah.
And stay tuned. Even more creativity going into that, because we feel like the battery technology is getting even better. So I often tongue-in-cheek say get leather, because the rest of the car is probably falling apart around the battery. So
Yeah. That's another area which we haven't even been able to talk that much about is battery technology. So that obviously GM, that you guys have your interest there and in developing your own batteries with the Ultium platform, as I'm familiar. But that's just another thing is as the EV market evolves, going back to what you were saying, Alex, about there are all these things that we can't even think of yet. You know, for as long as batteries have been around, like the innovation in the space has been a little limited until we have all these new applications, and now there's an explosion of new applications, and I think that's only going to grow. But if you could say anything more about where you see kind of the battery market heading, I think that would be appreciated.
competition is a beautiful thing, right? I mean, that's what you're in right now. Every automaker on some level is reinventing itself or inventing itself at the same time, right? And one way or the other, the fact that the Tesla's had the success that they've had has sort of put a nice competitive element to all of this. And I think that's what's going to happen. People are going to continue to try to innovate on the batteries, make them more effective. What you probably are going to see is a battery that's suitable for its application. So medium and heavy duty batteries might look a little bit different than light duty vehicle batteries, which would be a little bit different than some of the storage applications. But how to put all those pieces together? How do you get them all to work? Right? We have a really slick Ultium platform is really designed to actually wirelessly manage each of those battery modules. I could put in a Gen 1 and a Gen 5 next to each other, and that wirelessly battery management will make it work together, right? So there's this really so much innovation in this space driven by competition that, again, next 5, 10, 15 years is going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be, to your horse analogy, Sarah, who can hook it up and who can pull, and how will that shape out? And we're obviously investing to win that future.
Hey, very cool. So just one last question for you both. Then we'll wrap things up here. Is what is exciting, the most exciting to you about working in electrification right now?
Well, everything we've already said, plus, no, I mean, I think for me, it's like, this isn't a math equation where 1 plus, like we're going to figure out the answer. Like this is very much being created right now. And there's all these different factors that we've explained. And like, truly, like the future is being figured out right now. It's not this equation that we're just kind of following a plan on. Like we are very much sorting this out in all these different questions and all these different industries right now. And that to me is really exciting because we really are putting our fingerprints on this.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. This stuff is complex. There's no answers. Most of what I tell my leadership is we're going that way. Right? And they're like, but we want an answer. And I think now they're getting comfortable. Like, listen, we need to make bets along the way and think about how we sort of put those puzzle pieces together. But I totally agree with Sarah. It's so much fun. You have to be really comfortable with being really uncomfortable. You have to be really comfortable with ambiguity and not knowing how these things are going. But you have to be really smart about putting a strategy together that takes you in that right direction and allows you to pivot along the way as this happens. So that is totally agree with Sarah. That's what to me is the most fun. In 10, 15 years from now, hopefully when I'm retiring, I'll look back at just how fond I was of the lack of clarity and being able to play in that field at any point in time. So
All right. Well, thank you both very much, and to everybody in the audience for attending today's session to learn more about electric vehicles and the careers they will enable. So the next session is going to be starting shortly, and for those of you at the exhibit hall, it remains open for you to meet with energy companies from all around the country. So thank you very much for coming, and have a great day.
Yep. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.